Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long View. Julian Zelizer, and I'm very happy to be here with Jeremi Suri, who is also a Substacker, Democracy of Hope, and professor at the University of Texas, great foreign policy and political historian. I urge you to read his many, many books. Jeremi, thanks for joining The Long View.
It's great to be with you, Julian, and congratulations on a terrific Substack that you put together.
Thank you to you as well. It's nice to have some historians on this space, and it's nice to have the freedom to go a little deeper. And I wanted to look. It felt like a huge week in foreign policy. So you're the first person I thought of with Greenland and everything surrounding it. And the key issue here, in many ways, was NATO itself and what this could do. Can you explain, as you do to students, for people who are not um, as well versed in and why has NATO mattered and why does it still matter to the United States?
NATO is the most successful alliance in history at helping countries that were formerly at war with one another to work together for their mutual defense and also for their mutual democratic development. Now, some historians would argue that the democratic developments in Western Europe that occurred after World War II were parallel to NATO, but I'm one of the historians that believes that NATO was fundamental to providing the security and the cooperative framework that transformed Germany, that transformed France, that was as significant in the democratic development of those societies as the Marshall Plan was. And NATO successfully deterred Soviet aggression, which we know there was serious consideration of during the Cold War. Post-Cold War, NATO has provided a basis for the United States to continue to cooperate with its allies. And we should remember that in Afghanistan, many NATO countries, particularly Denmark, provided extensive support, especially early on in the war when this was an anti-terrorism operation. So this is at the cornerstone of the free world, security, and democracy.
And so when some supporters of the administration or the president himself argues this is outdated, everything you say might be true, but now it's no longer that world. How do you think of that argument?
I think that's entirely wrong-headed, and I don't say that for ideological reasons. I say that for very practical, material reasons, the things we study as historians, Julian. Three things NATO provides that are absolutely essential to the United States today. First, if our major strategic rivalry is with China, we need a tighter relationship with our European allies from economic and a military point of view, even from the perspective of strategic minerals. And so cooperating more tightly with our West European allies in particular is absolutely essential. Second, if we want to limit the aggression of countries like Russia, North Korea, and to some extent China, and certainly Iran, we do need a rules-based order. What a rules-based order does is it provides certain limitations and assumptions, and it provides moral sanction against countries like Vladimir Putin's Russia that are clearly violating what we would assume to be norms of peaceful behavior. That cannot be outdated if we care about these issues. And then third, I would just remind everyone that the NATO countries protect us as much as we protect them. NATO has only had Article 5 invoked once, which was on 9/11. One can very well imagine the United States getting inadvertently into a conflict with China or into a conflict with another country. And we would want the military support. It is significant in terms of resources that would come from an England, a Germany, and other countries like that. So I think NATO is as essential as it's ever been, Julian.
And then many people were definitely surprised by Greenland becoming such a huge issue and how serious it seemed to get in the last couple of weeks to the point of discussions of force. There's a history with this, and I talked earlier about President Truman in 46 trying to purchase it, but backing off quickly. Where is this coming from right now, and what do you think the significance is of the effort and this tentative agreement we're learning about for the broader picture of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think Greenland is important. That's not something this administration made up. It has been important for a long time. As I'm sure you discussed when you talked about 1946, this has been an area the United States has been concerned about because of its strategic location. And during the Cold War, the United States had a series of many important bases, including the Thule Air Base, which actually had nuclear armed American aircraft that would have been used to bomb the Soviets in kind of Dr. Strangelove style if there had been a nuclear conflict. By the way, one of those aircraft went down in 1969. There was a major accident. And the Danes were incredibly helpful in us in recovering the lost nuclear weapon and preventing a much worse incident from occurring. So Greenland is strategically important. There's also the issue of minerals. Um, but the United States has had an ideal relationship in many ways with Danes. The Danes have been very happy for the United States to operate in this space. They basically allowed us to do whatever we want to do. Contemporary concerns about the Arctic have grown because of the melting of the ice. Global warming is real, and it's opened up strategic passageways and the possibility of more Russian and Chinese, as well as Norwegian, activity in the area, and Canadian as well. And the United States is somewhat behind in our icebreakers and in our various materials. So I think there are some people around Trump who believe this is a way of leaping ahead by taking this territory, establishing a beachhead. It's a very real estate way to think about things, right? We want to grab this territory and we can jump ahead of our adversaries who have invested more in operating in this space by owning it. I think that's wrongheaded, but I think that's where this comes from. And then I think there's also just the ego element of being able to argue that this is an achievement, that we've taken territory. I mean, you and I both, Julian, have written about this. There are imperial impulses within American politics. And this is an imperial impulse that hasn't gone away, that Donald Trump wants to turn into a personal ego trip as well.
And speaking of imperial, the other issue that seems to have now disappeared, but was very important a week ago, was in Venezuela. And putting aside Maduro himself, how do you see the significance of what the U.S. did, meaning the operation of extracting a leader of a sovereign country under the guise of a police action? How does that fit in the broader constellation of U.S. policy and in that region in particular?
There's so much to say about that, Julian, and I know you speaking very eloquently about this too. I mean, so first, what the United States did has precedent. The United States spent much of the early 20th century repeatedly invading countries in the Caribbean, often to seize resources when they didn't pay back their debts, to, in Theodore Roosevelt's words, provide a sanitary and safe environment. That's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's worth reminding people the Monroe Doctrine is not interventionist. It does not justify American intervention. It simply is against foreign intervention of other kind in the region. The Roosevelt corollary was about American intervention. So there is some history there. But over the last 60 to 70 years, American leaders, Democrat and Republican, had come to the conclusion that not only is it better morally to be a good neighbor, that it works better for us. What did we learn with repeated interventions in Cuba and Nicaragua and elsewhere? Is that actually these societies that look small, though Venezuela is actually twice as large as Iraq, people forget that. These are very difficult countries to govern from the exterior, and often our arrival makes the situation worse. That's not about our intentions. That's about what happened. That is a lesson that Ronald Reagan understood as well as Jimmy Carter, right? And the reason Reagan was supporting the Contras was because he didn't want American forces in there. The presence of an American occupation would only make for more disorder on the ground, and it would be very costly for the United States. The Trump administration, I think, knows that. So they've tried to do this on the cheap. Well, we also tried that in Iraq and in Libya, and we saw what happened there. I don't understand what the end game is here in Venezuela. I don't see this as a model for anything but disaster, Julian, because the current government, which is just the Maduro government under Delcy Rodriguez, is not going to be any different in the way it treats its citizens. It's not going to improve the oil infrastructure. The oil infrastructure problems are the problems of that regime. If we take some of that oil, we're going to be taking the oil from the people, not from the leaders. That is going to create famine conditions. that is going to create a situation where we have more disorder on the ground that we will either have to ignore or get involved in. So I don't think this is a model at all. Unfortunately, though, it gives justification to individuals like Vladimir Putin and perhaps Xi Jinping, who want to justify their own extraction operations, which is, of course, what Ukraine initially was. Putin intended to take Kiev and remove Zelensky. How do we argue against that now? How do we make a strong statement to the world when we have done the same and perhaps done it in an even more sloppy way?
I keep hearing this argument that we're in this new era where the Soviets, or the Russians, the US, and China are kind of carving out parts of the world, which in some ways is reminiscent of the Cold War, even though it's a little different. Do you think that is where we are? Is that the kind of foreign policy world or international relations world that we have now entered into?
One of the things that's wonderful about being a historian is, unlike other disciplines, we don't say it's just one thing. So there is definitely an element of that. There's no doubt we are seeing more inequalities in military capability, perhaps. They've grown. And we are seeing the rise of peers or near peers to the United States. So if we were in a period of hegemony of one kind or another, we're now in a period of great power rivalry. And you're right, there is a kind of spheres of influence element to this. But that's only one dynamic of what's going on. I think Prime Minister Carney from Canada identified very intelligently another element, which also is reminiscent of the 19th century, which is the rise of middle powers. Countries not just like Germany, Britain, and Canada, but Israel is a middle power,
Mm.
right? Syria, to some extent, is a middle power. Japan is a middle power, right? South Korea. These are countries that actually play a very important role in the regional expression of power and are essential to the global economy. And they play a very important role in determining where power operates and who can operate in which spaces. And I think it's safe to say that future dominance of the international system will be based not only on the growth of three powers, but their ability to form alliances. I think alliances, Julian, are becoming more important than ever. And we are systematically disabling ourselves from
Mm.
managing these alliances. And quite frankly, we're making it easier for the Chinese. I was in Brazil a couple of years ago, and you could already then see the Brazilians moving toward the Chinese for economic reasons. The United States made the argument then, we were making this argument, that we're a better bet for you, right? Wouldn't you rather have a stable democratic society as your partner, even though in the past we did bad things to you? How do we make that argument today? If the Chinese have alliances, which they're forming throughout Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, elsewhere, what are we going to how are we going to combat that as strong as we might be? So I think the alliances matter at least as much as the sphere of influence framework that we're seeing.
And I'm listening to you and I'm thinking 20 years ago, if we were having this conversation, kind of stateless networks of terrorism was the central kind of concern. Is that still on the minds of policymakers? Has it receded as a threat? Where is that?
No, I think that's another element. I mean, it's as Bill Moyer said of Lyndon Johnson, right? It's a multi-layer cake. There are many
Uh-huh.
layers to it, right? And I worry, and I know people who are more expert on this, on terrorism,
Yeah.
worry that what's happening in Iran actually enables more of this, right? So, on the one hand, Hezbollah and other terrorist groups have been weakened by Israel and by some of our activities. But we've now also given more reason for organizations that still exist to actually target us. And they have capabilities to do that. And we're in a cyber world, and we still haven't seen yet a major terrorist cyber operation, at least that we know of. But that's likely to happen sometime soon. So, yes, there are very strong, powerful non state actors in many different regions that we have to be worried about.
And how do you think, and we're in the middle of it, but you've written about the presidency, you've written about foreign policy making, you wrote a terrific, one of the best biographies of Henry Kissinger. Um, when you look at the foreign policy apparatus of the second administration, how do you how does it look from what you can see compared to what we've seen in presidencies in the last 50, 60 years?
I think this is one of the areas where we see autocracy. The American foreign policy system that's developed largely by Truman and Eisenhower. after World War II, and you've written about this too. Your Culture of National Security book is fantastic on this. That bureaucracy
Thanks.
is developed to actually provide expertise at a distribution of power. The insight that both Truman and Eisenhower have is that the United States' strength is not going to be the rapidity of its decision making nor the arbitrariness of it, but the consistency of it. You want consistent, thoughtful decision making. That's what containment is, right? Slowly holding back Soviet aggression, slowly turning back their opportunities into opportunities for us. We create a national security structure, a bureaucracy. We bring experts into government. We fund area studies at our universities, both of ours, to train people. We get the military involved in this strange structure where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not a decision maker, but an integrator of different views. And more often than not, that leads to pretty good decision making. In Vietnam, as Dick Betts and others classically wrote about, it's what gets us into trouble because the bureaucracy tells us there's always a solution when there might not be a solution. But nonetheless, it's a very stable way to make decisions, and it's a way to build consensus. We've moved away from that completely in the Trump administration. What I hear and read about is that people basically just sit around the Oval Office and wait for the president to express an impulse and
Hmm.
then find a way to try to implement that impulse, right? So this is more Versailles than the White House NSC. And that's just a terrible way to make policy. This is not an ideological statement. This is a historical statement. No single actor, the most intelligent in the world, can understand the problems deeply enough to make intelligent decisions in that way. And that's why our policy is batting around. And it's very difficult, Julian, for our ambassadors and others who want to defend us to actually defend what we're doing because they don't know what we're doing.
Hmm. And I remember when I assume you heard it, but at one point, Miller, after Venezuela, Stephen Miller was talking about how the U.S., how kind of world affairs works through force, essentially. And that's how the U.S. needs to operate. And people talked about Kissinger a little and his view of the U.S. interest. How does what we're seeing compare to how Kissinger thought of, realpolitik and exercising power?
Great question. So Kissinger certainly was a believer in the use our use of force, whether it's in Chile or Vietnam or the Middle East. But realism, as Kissinger and Morgenthau and the various others going back to Thucydides, realism is not the Melian dialogue. That's just a short part of the larger Thucydides work. It's not about bullies basically telling weaker kids that they have to give them their lunch. That's the way Stephen Miller was talking. That's exactly, it sounded like, our daughter's teaching second grade. It's what she sees in second grade, quite literally, right?
Mm.
That's not what realism is. Realism is about powerful countries getting other countries to do things through a mix of consent and deterrence and sometimes coercion. But realists like Kissinger understood that coercion is the hardest thing in the world. You want to stay away from that. You want to deter the behavior that you don't want to see. We did a good job of deterring Soviet aggression during the Cold War. And you want to build consent. How do you build consent? Often by making small concessions to countries to do bigger things for you. That's the whole point of the US European relationship. It's the US Japanese relationship. We provide certain things for you that also benefit us, such as mutual defense. In return, you provide us access to your markets. You provide us certain resources. You provide us help in regions we don't understand. You had an imperial past in those regions. You have expertise you can share with us. There's a wonderful essay that my advisor, Paul Kennedy, wrote years ago on the virtues of appeasement. And basically, the point is that most of the time, the stronger power appeases. That's how you get what you want. You can afford to do that. Julian, it's what you and I do as parents, too, right? We appease all the
Yes.
time, right? We just stand up on the strong issues if we can, right? So to think that you can just your way around is a total misreading of realism. It's bullyism is not the same as realism.
Mm. An important point and distinction. Before I go to the final questions, let me thank everyone, all the subscribers who are watching, and we appreciate this live and when I post it. And independent journalism depends on paid subscribers, so thank you to paid subscribers to both our Substacks, and hopefully some of you might consider turning yours, if you can afford it, into a paid subscription, so we can continue conversations like this and go in depth on the issues that matter today. So thank you
And
for
Julie,
considering it.
I can say this, I mean, just as a little pitch on my part, every penny that goes into my Substack, Democracy of Hope, and subscriptions goes to my graduate students.
That's great.
Because, I
That's
mean, you
great.
have salaries, right? You and I
Yeah.
have graduate
Yeah.
students, they're underpaid, and, at least that's what I do. I'm sure you're putting yours towards similar.
It's great, and that's terrific. The next thing I wanted to ask you, we've both written about executive power, and it's clear now you are seeing a pretty aggressive exercise of executive power with a Republican majority that is either not doing anything or accepting this, whatever your perspective. Are we at a tipping point on foreign policy in terms of where executive power is going in terms of policymaking?
Yes and no. I was thinking of your work today, Julian, when I was reading a piece in the New York Times on this. We are seeing the Trump push executive power farther than any executive has before, even farther than Lincoln did in the Civil War, which is saying a lot, right? We know it. But I also think why I was thinking of your work, Julian, is I think we're actually beginning to see a backlash against it. I think we might have, to some degree, a replay of what we had with the Watergate Congress, where we are going to see a new generation of members of Congress in both parties. More, of course, will initially be in the Democratic Party, but we'll see some in the Republican Party. Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually a bellwether here, who are going to say, this has gone too far. And now we need to put restrictions in place. And for Republicans, they want to put these restrictions in place so a Democratic president doesn't have them. And I think we're going to end up back in the debate about the War Powers Resolution, which, as you and I have both written, did not work as it should have, but still for a while had some teeth. And for example, President Ford was forced to agree to not assassinate foreign leaders, to take that off the table. That still is operative legislation. We've gotten around it. Obama did, as did Trump. But I think we're going to be back in that debate. And I think it's going to be actually a worthwhile debate to have. Presidential power will still remain awesome and in some ways untethered in foreign policy. But I think we're going to see new efforts. And I think people are going to go back to that history of the early 70s and try to, in a sense, return to some of those restrictions on executive power. Just to give you one example, the one that I've been thinking a lot about the last few days is how money is used that presidents acquire through foreign policy. It's absolutely crazy that people don't know if oil from Venezuela is sold to the U.S., where the money's going to go. Right?
Final, yes, yes. Did you want to continue
No,
on
no.
that? Sorry for, okay. I mean, the final thing I wanted to ask you is a little different, and you're a historian, such as I am, that is trying to make contributions to public debates about these issues. How do you think of the value, or how to use history effectively to inform current discussions? What's your kind of particular take on that?
So I've thought a lot about this, as you have, and I did a book years ago, History and on sort of learning from the past, sort of a remake of the classic work by Richard Neustadt and Ernest May on this. And you've done these terrific volumes, Julian, on different presidents and what we can learn from
Thanks.
history. So what is it that I think? I think there are two ways in which history really should be useful. What you and I think, are trying to do. First of all, we have to know how we've gotten where we are. We have to know why we have NATO, just the question you started with, right? It's very easy in the short term not to see the value in things, or to put it another way, it's very easy to think that what the people before us did makes no sense because on this day, it doesn't look useful. We really need to understand why we do what we do. And I say that to people on the left as well as the right. Before you want to throw away everything that the prior mayor of New York did, even if he was a fool, understand why things were done. So that's the first thing. And I think that's lacking in our world. That's harder to get at today because everything is so presentist focused. Everything is so outrageous, right? We lose sight. And I think that's one of the jobs you and I are doing and why I try to write for the public, to inform the public. And then second, I think there are the right questions to ask and there are the wrong questions to ask. The wrong question to ask today is how the United States can dominate the world more, et cetera, et cetera. The right question to ask, the historical question, is what have we done to provide ourselves over the last 50 years a pretty good run? And what can we take from that going forward, right? So I think we as historians don't always have the answers, Julian, but we can refocus things on the right questions. And that's often what I'm trying to do with op-eds and in our Substack. Our books do the first thing. They provide the historical background, and then our essays and our Substacks and our discussions like this refocus the questions for us.
Well, this was great, everyone. Jeremi Suri is one of my favorite historians, and I really, really urge you to read his Substack, but also to buy his books and read them. I mentioned the Kissinger one, which is really just a terrific example of how you write a biography and put someone in context in thoughtful ways, and all your other writing. Also, a great book on détente, on the presidency, much, much more. But look him up. And Jeremi, let's do this again. And thanks for joining the Long View.
Thank you, Julian.
Okay, bye bye.